gut feelings. I'm going to hire people who make me feel good, that is a pretty frightening prospect. And certainly on these economic, well, both on the fact that of nuclear weapons, that I don't even want to think about that. But on the economic issues, not only is it, his gut feelings are protectionist, but he has an image of the way things that should be, which is about 50 years out of date. He wants America to be a heavy industrial country in the way it was when he was a young man. And that is just not going to happen. But the attempts to make it happen can be extremely destructive to America and to the world as a whole.
Professor Krugman, I'm completely out of time. I know there are questions, but the next speaker is waiting. Thank you very much, Professor Krugman. 2 gems I take away from this conversation. You don't get to Denmark levels with Chinese levels of corruption. There's a lesson for all of us there. And the other gem, President Trump is not taking his job seriously. That's interesting. Thank you very much, Professor Krugman.
Thank you very much, Paul Krugman, and thanks also to Lata Venkatesh. As journalists, we are trained to question, to probe, and to put to test. And that is exactly what we're going to do now in our session that's coming up, testing our very hypothesis of rising India. It gives me great pleasure in welcoming Ruchir Sharma, who's the head of emerging markets and global macro at Morgan Stanley. He'll be speaking to us on the topic, India rising, or is it? Ruchir joined Morgan Stanley in 1996. He's got more than $20 billion of assets under management in emerging markets. He typically spends 1 week every month in a different emerging market where he meets leading politicians, CEOs. He started writing for newspapers, I believe, when he was 17. And he's best known for 2 books, Breakout Nations and The Rise and Fall of Nations. He was also named one of the 50 most influential people by Bloomberg Markets magazine in 2015, and that is alongside the likes of Barack Obama, Janet Yellen, and Warren Buffett. A very, very warm welcome to you. Ruchir, please welcome to Rising India. Ruchir Sharma, and this session will be moderated by Shireen Bhan, Managing Editor of CNBC TV 18. Ladies and gentlemen, Ruchir Sharma.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us for what promises to be a provocative session here at the Rising India Summit. As Zaka pointed out, what we're going to be testing today is the hypothesis whether India is really rising and what it will take for us to really come closer to that aspiration of becoming a middle-income economy and how soon we are going to be able to get here. My guest today needs no introduction. Zaka's already told you a lot about what he does and how he does it. But Richard, let me start by asking you, over the course of the past 24 hours, we've heard a lot of what is working for India. We're growing at about 7%, a little over 7% today. That's the kind of growth rate that we've seen over the past decade. Macros perhaps looking a little less favorable than they were over the last 3 years. On the basis of the parameters that you track, and you have 10 ways of identifying whether a nation is rising or falling, in 2018, how does India look to you?
Right. My consistent narrative about India, and this is something that we've spoken about in the past, is that ever since I've sort of been tracking this for the last 25 years closely, is that this is a country that consistently disappoints the optimists and the pessimists. So if you get too lost with one narrative, you're likely to fail in India. I think that what we have seen basically is the fact that a couple of years ago, there was a lot of optimism, almost as if like it was only a matter of time before we would get to 8 to 10% economic growth. And that really hasn't happened. Now, I think we are sort of entering a very critical period where I think that the global economy is doing well.
Yes.
But as far as India is concerned, it's not been able to fully participate in this massive global economic revival that we have seen over the past 18 months or so.
What's gone wrong?
Well, I think there are 2 or 3 factors. There are the obvious ones which we have spoken about demonetization and the teething problems with GST. But I think that the one sort of really big problem which hasn't been fixed in India. And if you look at it, that if you look at all the major economies in the world, when they went through some sort of a banking crisis, until the banking system was fixed, it was very difficult for those countries to get back to their full potential. This goes back to Italy, to the United States. So the banking system, the financial system is really the artery. It lies at the heart of what a nation can do, and in terms of what its growth rate is. And that, for me, has been the single biggest shortcoming of the last few years.
It's been the biggest missed opportunity. You believe that the government should have exercised the political majority it enjoys to be able to drive through banking reforms, which in your mind means privatization.
Yeah, because, I think there's been a lot of debate about privatization and whether that's the thing to do or not to do, and all sorts of ideological debates have come about. For me, it's a very simple number which tells you about really what's going on out here, which is that in India, like as you know now, about 2/3 of the assets are with the public sector banks. This is the highest of any democratic country in the world. The average across emerging markets is about 1/3 in terms of what it is. So every country needs a public sector to meet some social objectives. But there is no country like India where the figure is this lopsided. So I think that, for me, that's the issue. It's not about public versus private. It's about a balance. That in the banking system, the average number in which the share is there across the world is about 1/3, and India's at 2/3. And there's a side effect to this, which is that if you look at all the incremental economic the financial activity, it's all happening through the private sector banking in terms of whether it's got to do with trade finance, credit cards, the massive retail lending that we are seeing. A bulk of it is happening through the private sector banks anyway. So what India is seeing is really privatization by malign neglect. That it's not happening explicitly, but the banking system is being privatized, but it's happening at a huge cost, whereas the public sector banks are not only being destroyed in value, but it's also choking the economic recovery. And for me, the single biggest fear just now in India, if you ask me what is the biggest risk to India in 2018, I think the single biggest risk to India, if you ask me currently, is the fact that we have a regulatory overkill. That we have seen we have seen this.
Are we likely to see a regulatory overkill, or we are already seeing a regulatory overkill?
I think we're already seeing parts of it.
Okay.
And this is, already manifesting itself in many ways. Now, I do believe that many public sector banks are going to be completely frozen to lend, given the sort of regulatory overkill that we are seeing currently.
So you believe that there is going to be a credit freeze?
Not a credit freeze, because the private sector banks have taken such an increased share, and I think that they will keep lending. But there are many sort of side effects of this. The first side effect is that the access to credit is going to get more and more directed towards the big companies with established credits, right? So a problem in India in the last few years, and this is a global problem, but it's been sort of accentuated in India, is that the big have gotten bigger. So if you look at companies in each sector, the top companies have just kept gaining market share at the cost of the smaller companies. And when you have this type of a credit environment, it's the small and medium-sized businesses which get hurt the most when you have, the sort of risk aversion which sets through. And a lot of the private sector banks will be able to lend, but a lot of the public sector banks are going to be really frozen. And even the private sector banks are going to be much more cautious about who we are lending to, what the credits are, because the cost now of making a bad loan has gone up a lot. It's almost become like a criminal offense. And I think that this is what India has to be careful about, which is that we have to avoid this temptation for regulatory overkill. And this has already been playing itself out in many ways.
Okay.
One is the banking sector. The other statistic which I find, which is what we just came up with, which I find quite staggering, is that since 2014, 23,000 millionaires have left this country.
23,000 millionaires have left India since 2014?
Yes.
Okay.
And in terms of, you notice in terms of what's going on here, and to put this in a global perspective, last year, 7,000 millionaires left this country, the largest number in recent times. The year before that, it was 4,000. So the number is going up of the number of millionaires leaving this country. In absolute terms, this is still behind China, but as a share of total millionaires leaving this country, this is the largest of any major nation in the world. So that so we're seeing
How
this.
do you explain that?
Well, of course, some will say this is a good thing, that this is an anti-corruption drive and we're driving all the corrupt away. But I think that there's a major side effect of this, which is that at the end of the day, you need your own domestic people to invest in your country. I think that is very important. You know, foreign investment is important, but it's really domestic sort of participation, domestic investors who sort of make a nation going forward. So I think that, to me, this has to be really sort of looked into, that why are so many millionaires leaving this country? And if you're happy about it because you think this is part of the anti-corruption drive, fair enough. But when the number is the highest in the world, at least as a share of total millionaires leaving the country, that should be a cause for concern.
Well, that's a significant headline that you've given us, Ruchir, that India has the highest number of millionaires leaving the country. And, you know, since you talked about domestic investment, yesterday we had a session here with business leaders, and Deep Kalra, who, in a sense, is part of the startup ecosystem and, of course, has now been around for more than a decade. His point was that India has taken Atithi Devo Bhava to a whole entire level, where you're welcoming foreign direct investment, you're welcoming foreign companies, but at the cost of domestic entrepreneurs, domestic entrepreneurship, and not providing a level playing field. Does this number that you just gave us, in your mind, also perhaps have something to do with the point that Deep made?
Yeah, I think so. I think that that's absolutely true because, you know, like you go to Dubai today and you're likely to meet more Indians out there than you're likely to meet in a restaurant in Bombay or Delhi or something like that. You know, like, so you can see as to where the capital is fleeing, what the magnets for capital are, Dubai, Singapore, of course, back in like the US and UK. So that, I think, is definitely the point. But, you know, as I say about India, that what's fascinating for me, I wear many hats. One of them is that of a foreign investor as well.
Yes.
What's fascinating about this country is that how this country keeps on rising. So in fact, I know that your thing is India rising. My thing is that this country is forever rising, you know, whatever you want to sort of make out of it, right? So that it's on a continuous sort of upward march, but it's a sort of chaotic march, and for every sort of positive story, there's a negative story. So what's happening in India, as you said, many domestic sort of people are leaving, and also the fact that the big are getting bigger. But this also remains a dream for investors like us. And why do I say that? The highest number of quality companies in the world, in any developing country, but I'd say in the world, at least as a share, we find in India. Over the last 5 years, there have been about 70 companies in India with a sort of market cap of at least $1 billion, which have doubled in value. You don't get that kind of sort of richness in other sort of emerging markets. In places like Brazil, we can find 10, 20. Russia, we can barely find half a dozen. So on one